Well, today we're going to have a heart to heart about something dear to every Canadian, and that is our healthcare system. Well, the picture is not pretty as millions of Canadians sit on waiting lists, waiting and waiting. And sadly, thousands die waiting on those waiting lists. So we're going to talk about that today with our next guest. So, with me here today to talk about the state of healthcare in our country is Colin Craig. And Colin is the president of secondstreet.org. And Colin, I'm so glad to have you on the program as we talk about the state of healthcare. You just released a report about the number of Canadians, millions of them on waiting lists. So, you're going to help us give us quote reality therapy on the real situation here, and I think this will be quite a revelation. So my question to you is, how does this situation look at a glance? Are there a lot of people on waiting lists in Canada?
Yeah, and thank you for having me, David. Always appreciate chatting about public policy with you. Um, the long story short is that we asked governments across the country for data on how many people were waiting to see a specialist, to receive a diagnostic scan, and to receive surgery. And governments gave us back some numbers that kind of look like Swiss cheese. There's a whole bunch of holes in them. And
Mm.
what those figures showed was there's about 3.1 million Canadians waiting for one of those three types of healthcare services. But like I said, there's holes in the numbers where some provinces will give us one of the numbers but not the other two, or maybe two but not the third, and so forth. So what we did is we took that 3.1 million and we did some extrapolating to say, okay, if we've got it for kind of this portion, what would it look like across the whole country as a whole?
Mhm.
And it looks like it's about 5.1 million. So it's more than one in
What?
10 Canadians right now are waiting for one of those
So
types of.
you're saying that over 5 million Canadians are waiting for some kind of medical treatment. It could be anything,
Yeah.
right? And it's that amount of Canadians. I mean, eh,
Mhm.
so and you said Swiss cheese. Did you mean in the sense that, the data is not available or they didn't wanna share the data with you?
It's the worst of the scenarios you present. They just don't have it. They can't
No
tell us.
kidding.
They can't tell us. Well, we don't know how many are whatever waiting for surgery or waiting to see a specialist or whatever. Like, it is it is pretty appalling when you look at government data and management of healthcare. It's generally a mess. And we're
Wow.
at the beginning of this conversation. I'll say this because I think it's important if we stand back and look at the big picture. We've
Mhm,
got 10 provinces in this country. We've got a mix of provincial governments that maybe they're run by the NDP or the Liberals or the Conservatives.
mhm,
And I would encourage all of your viewers to reflect on this question. Are any of the 10 provinces providing exceptional health care?
mm,
Is there a leader in this country where we can really look at that province and go, wow, they're knocking it out of the park? Short
mhm,
times, we never hear horror stories. I would argue that the answer is no. We do not have a real leader in healthcare when it comes to delivering exceptional services. And despite that, we've got all three parties running it. And if you look back over, say, the past decade, too, we'd find the same story.
mhm,
So we've got different parties all kind of shuffling the deck chairs around on this Titanic called
mhm,
healthcare. And the end result is just that patients are suffering as a result. The problem is structural. We spend a lot of money on healthcare as a nation. We're one of
mhm.
the highest spenders on healthcare in the world. Our
One of the
results,
highest.
one of the
Wow.
highest. Yeah, and that's not me. That's the Canadian Institute for Health Information noting
Mhm.
that right on their website. That's a government funded entity. So we got a
Okay,
lot of
so
money in the system.
we
Got a
actually have a graph right here, Colin, that
sure.
says your point is that per capita, per person in Canada, we're spending a lot of money, and you said that internationally, we would be number 1 or 2 in the world in terms of healthcare spending.
One of the highest. I'm not sure the exact ranking right now, David, but we always hear this argument. People say, "Oh, it's because of the cuts. There's not enough money, and so forth."
Mhm.
And You know what? There might be areas of healthcare where there's not enough money. I'm sure you can find some examples.
Mhm.
If
Mhm.
you look at the whole system, the money is in the system. I think the problem is the money's not getting to the services that help patients enough.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
we can get into that, but just if we stand and look at the big picture, a lot of money in the system, various parties, political parties trying to make it work. It's not working. We've also got a lot of good people in the system too. I mean, everyone can think of a nurse or a
Mhm. For
doctor,
sure.
people got into the system trying to help patients. I
Mhm.
think the problem is the structure itself. I wouldn't say I think. I know
Okay.
the problem is the structure itself. And until we change that structure to get it a little bit more focused on helping patients,
Mhm.
then we're continue to hear horror stories across the country.
Okay, so yeah, I would agree that we have outstanding people in the system, but the system design, as you're alluding to, the structure, as you're
Mhm.
saying, is quite flawed, if not broken in many respects. So this is really quite a remarkable story, and I think, I mean, let's dive into the numbers here a little bit more. Here, we've got a number of slides I think that help illustrate the state of the nation when it comes to healthcare. So I want to bring up the first one, which is Canadians on waiting lists for healthcare. And maybe you can explain what this number means.
Yeah, so this is the figure I was referring to earlier. That's what the government data shows. But if you go on our site and below that, there's kind of a link where people can expand it. And that's
Mhm,
where we get into the details to say, yeah, this is what the government data shows. But if you extrapolate to fill in some of the holes, then what you're going to find is that the true number is probably closer to around 5.1 million.
hard to
So
believe.
it's a lot. And David, we're talking about stats. I mean, behind all these figures, of course, are everyday people that are suffering.
Mhm,
Because it's not
mhm,
just that there's a
exactly.
lot of people on a waiting list. If these are 5 million people and they're all waiting a week, that's not too bad, right? To
Yeah.
get in and get your surgery in a week or diagnostic scan, whatever the case is. But we know that that's often not the case. Someone waiting 6 months to get an MRI, 9 months
Mhm,
to see a specialist, a year to see a specialist, whatever it is, another year or two to get surgery. I mean, these wait times are just appalling. You talk to people in other developed nations, especially in Europe, and they start to kind of like, what? What?
mhm.
They hear you in disbelief because they don't face these wait times to the same degree that we do here in Canada.
Well, and I really resonate with your point, Colin, that behind each one of these numbers, and we know this anecdotally from people like it may be yourself or family members or friends, where they all have the stories where they've been waiting for, oh, I don't know, a hip replacement or a knee replacement or something that is really important, even dealing with a cancer diagnosis, and they're on waiting lists, and in some cases for years. And I mean, it's just chronic pain in so many cases that is just debilitating. And anyways, it's really quite tragic. The next slide has to do with waiting times in Canada, and I think this is an interesting one. Can you explain what this is, Colin?
Yeah, and so this is from our CanadaWaits.ca website as well. And when you look at the numbers, these are from the Fraser Institute, actually. We thought they were important numbers, so we
Mhm,
put them up on the
mhm.
site to just help people understand some of the big picture indicators. So, as we were just talking about, a lot of people waiting, but when you look at this shows how long people are waiting from the time that they, try to see a specialist until they actually receive treatment. And you can see it's grown over the years from 9 weeks in the early 1990s, 1993, to 30 weeks as of 2024.
Wow.
So spending has skyrocketed, wait times have skyrocketed. That's not the type of relationship you want to see.
Mhm. So that's a long time. Is that unusual internationally in your, analysis and research, Colin? Is that an unusual amount of time, like 30 weeks for a wait?
Yeah, and the data is there's not the best data comparing countries, but when I have seen data, yes, it shows that Canadians tend to be wait the longest amount of time. The Canadian or the Commonwealth Fund out of the United States, they do a good international report every year or two where they look at comparing universal systems, 10 of them, Canada being one of them. And yeah, when they've shown data in the past, we're usually one of the worst offenders, if not the worst offender, when it comes to the long wait times. So,
Wow.
people often talk about how our system is free. It's not free. We pay for it through our taxes. But
Hmm.
um, yeah, is it really free if you're on a waiting list? As the Supreme Court famously noted, access to a waiting list is not the same as access to healthcare.
Exactly. Well said. So, our next slide is a hard one to look at. It's about patients dying on waiting lists.
Hmm. Yeah, this is obviously a very sad situation. We gather government data each year on patients dying while waiting for surgery, diagnostic scans. And, again, it's a bit of a Swiss cheese type situation where some governments simply don't track the data. But since 2018-19, that fiscal year, we've calculated there's been about 75,000 cases according to the government's own data. And, I always like to be very clear about this. This covers a wide array of health services. So it's everything
Mhm,
from someone waiting to get cataract treatment to cardiac surgery, something
mhm.
involving your heart. So in the case of the former, you're not probably not going to die because you don't have cataract surgery in time. But we always note when people try to discount those cases to say, well, wait a second here, there's a quality of life issue here. For someone to spend the final year or two of their life waiting for cardiac or cataract surgery and having cloudy vision, I mean, that's no way to spend your final years. So, there's those cases. They seem to be the majority, those types, David, whether it's cataract, hip operations, knee operations, those types of things, which affect people's quality of life,
Mhm.
rather than things like cardiac treatment, cancer treatment, and so forth. There certainly are those cases. And one bit of data that we came across from Ontario uh, from last fiscal year, 2023, 2024, showed there was 115 people that died waiting for heart surgery. And of those, 41 died after waiting longer than the maximum recommended wait time. So
Wow.
it certainly should be setting off alarm bells in that province. We see other cases. We just profiled a story from Manitoba, actually, where there was a patient, Debbie Fuster. She was told that she needed heart surgery within 3 weeks. She lasted on a waiting list for about 2.5 months, and then she passed away. So there's a
Wow.
lot of stories like that. In Debbie's case, her family, she left behind 3 children, 10 grandkids. So there's a
Mhm.
huge hole in that family now. It's a very sad situation that they've lost their mother. Um, and it was didn't have to happen. In her case, if they had told her right at the beginning, we can't get you this potentially life-saving treatment within the recommended time frame, her family's told us that if they had known that, they would have done everything possible to try and get her treatment outside the province, remortgage their
Exactly.
houses, borrow money, whatever it takes to get their mother that treatment. But
What a tragedy.
yeah.
That is so sad to hear that. And I think we've all, again, heard these really awful stories of people just desperately wanting to get their procedure done,
Hmm.
but being roadblocked time and time again. And this has huge consequences. And I think you said not only in terms of death, but people suffering a pretty bad quality of life. So I think this research, though, is so important that Second Street is doing, and yourself, Colin. And I guess the thing that bothers me as well is why would this data, if human beings are important and their lives are important, why would this data not be readily accessible and top of mind? I don't get it.
It should be, and David, we like to compare what governments require of private businesses compared to what they're holding themselves to in terms of
Mhm,
accountability and standards. So across Canada, every single day, you'll find government employees going into restaurants and looking around for problems. Maybe there's some dish rags left on the floor. In one case, they reported an entity for not having a paper towel holder. That was their infraction that got them shamed on the government's website. Maybe they find a can of tomato paste with some mold on it, whatever.
mhm,
That all gets reported publicly. So, what happens when the government has someone die on a waiting list because they didn't get them treatment in time? Does that get reported publicly? No. To your point, it doesn't. And many provinces just don't even track the data. It's appalling.
mhm,
But they're
mhm.
quite happy to shame a private business when they make even the smallest infraction. So governments should be tracking this data. They should also be analyzing it. This is the other problem is that we get this data, but David, I've never seen any evidence, and I've talked to former government employees who have worked in the system, never seen any evidence that the state, through their health system, analyzes the data. They should be looking at these figures and going, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, we've had several people die in the past few years because we didn't get them heart surgery in time. We better make sure there's enough resources there or change something around, do whatever it takes to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But that type of analysis, from what we can see, just simply doesn't occur in government.
Well, that is entirely unacceptable. In good public policy, we know that one of the key principles is transparency. Another one is accountability.
Yeah.
And without that kind of data, it is like whistling in the wind. You can't improve your system that is affecting, as you've powerfully outlined with just these statistics, the impact it has on people's lives, including whether they even live or not. I mean, it's just, anyways, I just shake my head in disbelief at this, Colin. So the next slide is, of course, government spending. So if we bring up that, what does this say, Colin?
Yeah, so if you take all the money that government spends on healthcare and you divide it by the population, this gets you the amount the government is spending per person in this country on healthcare, and that is the orange bar. And if you go back to
Mm,
1993, this is the left side of this graphic, you can see it just grows and grows and grows up to the point where
mhm.
it's about 57.48 for last the 2023 year. Um, and so it's grown exponentially. The blue bar represents what it would have looked like if it had have grown at the rate of inflation.
Mhm.
So again, David, as we hear people sometimes say, "Oh, well, there's cutbacks, there's not enough money, and so forth." No, there's no cuts to healthcare. When you look at the overall spending, it has grown exponentially. And to my point earlier, there may be parts of the system, or maybe it needs more money because the money is being spent in other ways that isn't effective. But when you look at the whole, there's a lot of money in that system swashing around, and not enough of it is being spent on care for patients.
Well, it's really unbelievable to see those figures, Colin. And I guess another graph we could ultimately bring up here, which we don't have here, but you would be familiar with, is just the sheer amount of money that's being spent that makes up a percentage of every provincial, let alone federal government budget. So my question is, what's the summary out of that? Is it true that just about in every province, almost half our budgets are being spent by our healthcare system?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at the numbers, David, but I believe they're generally, you're right, in that 40 to 50% range. And it's the number one area of spending in provincial governments. There's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of money being spent on healthcare. I think what we're seeing, because you might remember this, but a decade ago, 2 decades ago, people were making these grand predictions that as of the year whatever, some year far off in the future,
Mhm.
there'd be two departments at, at the provincial level. One would be finance to raise the money, and two would be healthcare to spend it, because we have an aging population. And I don't think we've quite seen that play out, and it's because governments have done the unconscionable. Instead of getting this care that we need in a timely
Mhm.
manner, they're just rationing it. And so
Yes.
you see people, the wait times keep growing and growing and
Mhm.
growing to the point where we're hearing of people dying while waiting for surgery. 2 years to get your hip done, your knee done, whatever. Patients are leaving the country in droves to get the care they need. We actually met recently with four women from Alberta, did a little video with them where we talked to them because they had something in common, and that was that they all flew 7,000 kilometers to Lithuania in Eastern Europe to get their hips done.
Lithuania.
Four women from Alberta all the way over to Lithuania. There's actually a lot of cases where that is happening. We're hearing of patients going all over the world. Mexico, of course, the United States, because they're right next door, but
Mhm.
Mexico, China, Thailand, Germany, like I said, Lithuania, all over the place. There's a lot of very sad stories out there where people just get so desperate they cannot sit on a waiting list with severe pain anymore, and so they've already paid high taxes in many cases throughout their lives to the government,
Mhm.
for this grand promise that they're going to get healthcare. The government has failed. They have not delivered timely healthcare. And so now people have to reach into their pockets and pay for healthcare out of their own wallet and paycheck, whatever, because the money they've given to the government has been not spent appropriately, and they're not getting the care
Wow,
they need.
what a tragedy. Well, I think, Colin, you've alluded powerfully to the kind of statistics that illustrate where things are at with our healthcare system. We wanted to share a story, and her name is Kim, that talks more about, well, her story and the human cost on the people involved.
And when I went to go to some of the classes that they send you to before surgery, and I saw all of these poor old people in there in so much agony, you could just see it. We're all just in a lineup waiting for surgery. So, 9, 18 months, 2 years. I've heard worse stories than that, even.
Today, SecondStreet.org is going to talk to Alberta patient Kim Purdy about her really long and painful wait for hip surgery. But keep in mind that Kim ended up receiving surgery before COVID-19. During the pandemic, governments across Canada put thousands of hip, knee, and other operations on hold. So that means that even more Canadians are going to have experiences like Kim did. Here's Kim's story and some information on potential solutions.
Around Christmas time in December of 2017, I was making Christmas dinner. I all of a sudden noticed this terrible pain in my hips. And it just seemed so strange. It was very sudden. I went to the doctor and I told him about this terrible pain. And so he sent me in for x-rays. And I went back to him to see what they said. And he said, well, there's nothing wrong. I turned into like an old woman overnight. That's how I felt, using a cane and all these things. Oh, I had no life at all. Just parking. I would drive around and around till I could find something that was close to where I had to go if I needed to get the stuff. So my dog never got walked. Towards the end, I would try with a cane or something because I felt so bad about him not walking, just to walk to the end of our driveway. And I was always scared, what if I can't come back? The second Christmas that I had this, I couldn't do Christmas. We didn't even have a tree, no decorations, nothing. I mean, it was like going into the dark ages.
As her condition worsened, Kim eventually was put on a long waiting list in Canada for hip surgery. As months went by, her pain got to be so severe that she came very close to paying for surgery in the United States.
I ended up calling Gateway Institute and went down there. And it turned out that that was going to come into costing me $40,000 to go to the clinic in Kalispell, Montana, to get this done.
Fortunately, after pushing our healthcare system, Kim eventually received surgery in Canada after a 14-month wait.
And it was sharp, excruciating pain immediately. Very strange. From that time to when I actually got the surgery was approximately 14 months of waiting to get this pain rectified and get my life back.
Canada's healthcare system has its strengths and its weaknesses, and one area where we need to improve concerns the long waiting periods to see a specialist or to receive surgery. Now, this is because each year governments decide how much they want to pay for different procedures. So quite often, they just simply make people wait. What other countries do, countries with shorter wait times than Canada, is they have a public healthcare system just like our country, but they also allow more private healthcare options. Australia, Norway, New Zealand, those are just a few examples. And what this does is that the private healthcare system takes pressure off of the public healthcare system. You can learn more about this in our new report at secondstreet.org.
So there's that story about Kim, and I certainly want to commend her for sharing her story, and to you, Colin, and your team at Second Street for documenting those stories. That's not an unusual story for Canadians today, is it, Colin?
No, no, sadly it isn't. Um, when you know someone who's going through that uh, pain, David, it's incredible.
Mhm.
Just the stories that people share, and I haven't had to go through that. I feel very fortunate. I haven't had that type of pain
Mhm.
myself. But the first lady we did a story with in British Columbia, one of the nicest people you could imagine. She was an older senior, and she needed hip surgery. She described to us how, even just walking across her living room was something
Mhm.
she had to plan out, think out, because if she had to go and get the TV remote, she'd think, well, I may as well do something else at the same time because the pain was so bad. It's the type of thing that you and I and many of your readers wouldn't think twice about. But when
Mhm.
you have that severe pain, it can be so difficult to live with because it's chronic. It's there all the time. So for her, it was, moving across the living room she couldn't do. She couldn't babysit her grandkids because they were young and they'd crawl all over her and she couldn't keep up with them. She couldn't put on her socks without using this special kind of tool to help get her socks on in the morning.
Mhm.
Before all this pain began, she couldn't, or she would regularly go walking. She'd go on trips. She'd meet up with her friends. I think she was taking
Mhm.
Spanish lessons. This is a very active person. She loved life. And while she was dealing with the pain, all of that just got shut down and she was stuck in her apartment. So, we talk about people not dying from things like needing a hip operation, cataract treatment, and so forth, but there might actually be cases where that does happen because you could imagine if you're stuck in your apartment, not moving around for a year or two, you're not getting
Mhm.
exercise, which your body needs. And that can have compounding problems. Maybe you do end up dying because you're not getting exercise. So lots and lots of troubling stories out there. They're just awful and they're not ethical in a country such as ours. So it's just another example of why we need health reform.
I think you're absolutely right, Colin. I think there's also kind of a painful paradox to this, because I've wondered about this in the sense, Colin, that there are so many Canadians that have this story, and yet they are in a very weakened condition. They're often sick or chronic pain. God only knows what they're going through. So ironically, they're not in a position to speak up about it. They're hobbled, literally and figuratively, and they don't have a strong voice. And so this kind of discussion is important, but isn't that part of the dynamic is that the people in charge don't hear about these stories because the people themselves are too sick to talk about it. Is that part of the dynamic here?
I think in some cases, I think you're right. If you're dealing with crippling pain, whatever it is, contacting your politician might not be on your mind. And other times, there are lots of courageous people that do speak out and that they'll talk because it's one way where they can kind of vent and get things off their chest
Mhm.
and try and get things addressed. And we actually see this phenomenon, David, in Canada, where you will see someone goes to the media and it will
Mm.
get reported that they face like a 2-year wait to get to see the specialist or get surgery, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Sometimes 3 years, 4 years. I mean, I just saw a story from Manitoba of someone was waiting for 8 years. Like, I mean, just appalling cases. It gets into the media, and magically, within a couple days, there's a follow-up story. Oh,
Mhm.
John Doe is now getting his date for surgery. We told you about him a couple days ago,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So we have this just awful system where sometimes the squeaky wheel is getting the grease because they've gone
Mhm.
to the media. No patient should have to go to the media and share their personal health care problems with the general public
Mhm.
to get health care. But one of the worst things we do in the system too is that the government takes a lot of money from people in the form of high taxes. That we've been fed this promise that we're going to get quality health care. Too often we don't get the quality health care, or it's going to take 2 years, 3 years, just unacceptable long periods of time. And at the same time, the government says, oh, and you can't pay for this privately, locally. We have these bans in this country where the government will outlaw local patients from paying locally for private surgery. So you live in somewhere like Toronto, you can't
Mhm.
go to a private clinic and pay for a hip operation if you don't want to wait 2 years to get it or a year or whatever the amount of time is. The government doesn't allow it, which is incredibly unethical, and no other developed nation on this planet does that. And they don't do it for a reason. It's not ethical.
Well, as someone who's studied a lot of well, authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union, among others. I mean, what country has the moral audacity to say, well, no, you can't get that operation, Colin, because, well, it's somehow against some government policy? Surely I have a right. I mean, this is my body. I've only been given one and a life to lead. Surely I should have the prerogative, the choice to be able to, well, get a remedy for a health concern. But they don't see it that way, do they? Like, who are these people?
Well, they're authoritarian. There's no other way around it. It's appalling. It's unacceptable. It's unethical. Whatever words you want to
Mhm.
use for it, it's not right.
And are
Um,
we the only country that thinks this way? Like, if I go to Cuba, I think I can even find a private clinic there. If I go to China, I can find private clinics.
I was
Um,
going to say you can in China. China's communist government allows choice. Here in
but we
Canada,
don't.
we don't. We don't. There's some debate, to be honest, there's some debate about Cuba. My colleague actually phoned down there and she called a clinic. She speaks Spanish and they told her no.
Mhm.
They don't allow it for Cubans. Some other people that we know are quite knowledgeable about healthcare have said, "Yeah, you can." So I don't know. I mean, it's we've lost the battle and the whole discussion when we're
Wow.
debating whether or not we're with Cuba or not. There's a debate
Okay.
too about North Korea, but aside from those countries, if we look at our peer countries, Sweden,
Mhm.
Norway, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, you name it, countries that we're typically compared with, and none of them have these types of bans. One
Okay,
reason
so
why,
it's fair to say, though, internationally,
yeah,
and you've studied this too, we are a kind of a weird international outlier. We're unusual
we
on this
are.
planet.
We are. We have arguably the most authoritarian healthcare system in the developed world. In
Yeah.
that the government will tell you that you can't use your own money to try and improve your health. And the crazy thing, David, if you imagine this, you could take your paycheck tomorrow and spend all of it at McDonald's. You could
Mhm.
gamble it all at a local casino. You could spend it on tobacco,
Mhm.
alcohol, things that really aren't good for your health. I think that's pretty clear. And I'm not saying never go
Yeah.
to McDonald's. I go there myself too sometimes.
Sure.
My point is that you could spend your whole paycheck on things that are bad for your body, but use that paycheck to try and improve your health. Now government says, "Oh no, 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 no,
Wow.
you can't do that." I mean,
Yeah.
it's truly appalling. And
Utter nonsense. And correct me if I'm wrong, Colin, but there's also kind of a weird kind of, dare I say, animal farm kind of dynamic going on here too, where you've got people, we all know, every Canadian knows this. If you're in the healthcare system, you've got to be your own advocate, or fortunately, you have someone else be your advocate, an insider who can say, you know what, you've got to get this test done. Here's how to get it done, and not being on that waiting list. Everybody knows how the system works.
yeah,
But on top of that, is it fair to say, Colin, that there are, like an animal farm, these insiders that also get streamlined healthcare? Is that still happening? I know that years ago in Ottawa, there was a kind of a VIP list for people
mm,
who could get that extra healthcare faster, like an elite athlete. They don't sit in the line waiting for, what is it, 8 years, that poor lady in Manitoba.
yeah,
Where do they go? Where do they get their healthcare?
yeah. That's a very good question. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Is not the I may have butchered
Yes.
the quote, but that's the sentiment in Animal Farm. And um, yeah, I can tell you, I talked with a nurse, and she was retired. She was waiting to get her knee done, and she flat out said to me, "I could call the surgeon and get bumped
Mhm.
up, but my knee surgery, because I used to work with him, know him really well, but
Yeah.
my knee isn't too bad, so I'm not going to call in that favor." So yes, it does happen. I mean, I wouldn't hold it against people in the system. It's human nature. We all do
Oh,
this throughout our
sure.
lives, right?
Yes.
You need something. Hey, I know someone who works at that company or whatever. It's going to happen in government too. I
Mhm.
think the bigger problem is just the overall structure, and like we just talked about, the bans in place that don't give patients that choice. And I should actually clarify, the bans are a little bit complicated. They make no sense at all. A person in Calgary, generally speaking, can't pay for private surgery locally. There's one provider, it's a bit complicated. They figured out a way around it, but generally, most of them cannot. in Calgary, the private clinics cannot serve Calgary patients, people from Alberta. The same is true in British Columbia. Again, there's one provider where they've figured out kind of a loophole. But what you end up seeing is you see someone from Vancouver flying to Calgary for surgery because that is allowed, and someone from Calgary going to Vancouver for surgery because that is allowed. So you
Hmm.
get this happening across Canada where patients can fly to other provinces and pay. They just can't pay in their own province. It makes no sense. So what the government is doing is they're inconveniencing patients. They're making this whole thing cost more because they have to pay for flights. They're having to
Hmm.
get surgeries in places where they don't have family and support structures to help them after they've had surgery. The one exception to this is Quebec, where Quebecers can wake up in their own city and go down the street and pay for surgery. Um, Again, it's a little bit messy, but the big picture problem is we have these bans in place. We shouldn't. Other countries don't do it because I think one, for ethical reasons, to say to someone, you can't, we're going to take your money. We're not going to give you what we promised you. And we're not going to let you pay to try and help yourself. I mean, there's a whole ethical question about that. They don't allow it for that reason.
It
The other
really
is
is.
when you allow choice, some people that do pay, you take pressure off the public system.
For
Now
sure.
the
Yeah.
system doesn't have to treat that patient. They can focus on everyone else who can't afford to pay.
Okay,
So
but Colin, can you help us understand this? Because I think everybody, their heads would be spinning hearing this, saying, you mean to say if I live in Vancouver, I can fly to Calgary, get a procedure done if I need to. I can pay for it.
yeah,
And we've got to be passing each other in the air, right?
yes,
Going to another province. What is going on there? What special interests have such a lockhold on this system that they would create such an insane type of rule? What's going on here?
it doesn't make any sense at all. But you've explained it right. I mentioned there's a couple exceptions, and this whole thing just gets complicated. I'm speaking a little bit generally, David, because it does
Yeah.
get complicated. But there is a clinic, Canby Surgery Clinic in Vancouver, where they have found a way around this. I believe, where if they use a surgeon who is not part of the public system, then that surgeon can do the surgery locally. It's something like that. So same in Alberta. There's this rule where you have to be opted out and whatever. It's a mess. It doesn't make any sense that they do it this way. But clinics that haven't been able to figure that out, it means they can't treat people locally. So let me tell you a short story. I'll keep it as brief as I can. A patient from
Mhm.
just outside of Edmonton, wonderful guy, Jeff Chrishell, healthy all his life. Eventually, Father Time catches up with him, and he develops some back problems. Excruciating pain, facing a long wait
Mhm.
list in Alberta. Finally, gets to the point where he says, "I can't take it anymore." Like this guy, he
Mhm.
described having dark thoughts. Looked all across Canada for private clinics that might do the surgery that he needed. Found one in Calgary. The guy is elated. He thinks this is great.
Mhm.
Again, he's in Edmonton. He can drive down the road to Calgary. This is wonderful. Calls them. Calls going great until they say, "Wait a second, you're from Edmonton?" And he says, "Yeah, I can be there next week." "Sorry, we can't treat you. We're not allowed to." So he wasn't allowed to drive down the road to Calgary. In the end, he ended up going all the way to Atlanta, spending a considerable sum of money. So, I mean, there's a bad economic argument for this too, that we're
Mhm.
forcing people to take their hard-earned dollars out of our economy. And he had to get surgery down there. And in the end, his back is fine now after surgery. But why on earth do we make people do this? It makes no sense whatsoever.
I don't get it, Colin. We've got to get at this because, we think of the Canby Clinic. I mean, one of the heroes here, he's the former president of the Canadian Medical Association, Dr. Brian Day, a good friend. I mean, he spent a fortune defending a lawsuit where the province of BC and the federal government have loaded up and spent tens of millions of dollars trying to prevent them from serving everybody. I just don't understand why we as a country are so backward in this world when it comes to providing and opening up healthcare for everybody. It just seems to be so antithetical to the very objects of the Canada Healthcare Act. It just because we have a public healthcare system doesn't mean it has to all be delivered through kind of like a Soviet public administration. Isn't that the problem, Colin?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the problem. Think about education. K to 12 education across the country. People can choose between
Yeah.
sending their kids to the public system, private schools, homeschooling, whatever. And homeschooling, I wouldn't suggest you do home surgery on yourself
Oh,
if you
no.
have or something. But my point is that they have that choice between public and private, and the sky hasn't fallen.
Mhm.
It's not
Yeah.
like there's no teachers available because everyone wants private. I mean, it doesn't happen. But in healthcare, this is the claim: is that if you give choice, that somehow the public
Mhm.
system is going to fall apart. You look at a country like Sweden. Uh, it's around 87% of Swedes depend on the public system. About 13% pay for private health insurance. So that's, I think, pretty similar to our K to 12 system. The vast majority of parents send their kids to the public school system. That's totally fine. And a small percent decide they want something different. They send their kids to private schools. So, Sweden outperforms Canada. You look at all these other developed nations with universal healthcare systems, they're outperforming Canada. So, this claim by opponents that if you allow choice in Canada, the sky will fall. Uh,
Mhm.
so, the answer rebuttal to that is, well, why hasn't the sky fallen in Sweden, France,
Exactly.
and I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There's all kinds of countries that have universal systems, universal public systems, and they allow choice outside of it if people don't want to use the public system.
No, I'm with you, Colin. I think you're making a lot of sense here. So we got to wake up, get with the program. There's other countries that are pulling it off. Surely we can too. So let's talk about solutions. And I think you've underlined well that the solution isn't just shoveling more money at it. We're already spending what is it? We're number two on the expensive list when it comes to countries in healthcare. So you've got a number of solutions here.
Mhm.
Let's start with the first one. Let's track the data. Is that a good idea, Colin?
Yes, yeah, pretty obvious. Quite often you can't address a problem unless you have the numbers and the data to figure out what's going on. So yeah, track the data, report on it publicly, be honest about it, and that will help
Mhm.
solve the problem.
Right on. What about activity-based funding? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and this is a very important one, and a lot of people don't realize this, David. But if you think about how hospitals are funded in this country, basically what happens is the government gives them a big check and says,
Mhm.
"Good luck." They give them this big check and they say, "We hope you help a lot of patients this year."
Yes.
And so what that does is the hospital knows they've got this amount of money, and throughout the year they start to spend that money as they're helping patients. And so
Mm.
they're worried about running out of money, especially towards the end of the year. And so
Mhm.
you have the wrong incentives in place. No business out there would say, "Gee, I hope you don't get very many customers towards the end of the year," because it's
Right.
not how it operates, right? So
Yeah.
what they do in a lot of other countries is they use a different funding model.
Mhm.
They say to hospitals and other parts of the system, "We will give you money when you help a patient." So now
Mhm.
they're incentivizing hospitals to help patients, and they get different amounts
Ah.
depending on what they're doing. So delivering a baby might come with, I'm not sure, I'm going to make the numbers up here. Let's say $5,000. You do a
Mhm.
knee operation, maybe it works out to $10,000. So
Mhm.
the more babies you deliver, the more money comes into the hospital. The more knee operations you perform, the more money comes into the hospital. So now the hospital's incentivized when someone walks in the door to not see them as a patient to have to treat and be upset about it, but
Mhm.
rather a patient they want to treat because it means that they're going to get more money. So, it changes that customer service approach. "Come
Mhm.
on in, Mr. David. We're going to get you
Yeah.
some coffee," whatever, right? So,
No, but this makes a lot of sense. So, um, fortunately, I've been able to sit on different hospital boards and health authorities, and I see this up close where we got these global budgets, as you say, this big pot of money. But I like what you're saying is that we need to incentivize the system to look after more people, be more innovative by funding the specific activity. And I think that's a brilliant insight, Colin,
yeah,
because otherwise, gosh, it's almost like that would explain why the healthcare system is almost schizophrenic. So you come into the hospital into, say, emergency, they don't really want to have you hang around because you're kind of like a cost. And as much as people care and don't want you to die, they want to help you. They have an incentive behind the scenes by, not to vilify administrators, but to kind of keep you moving along. Is that kind of what you're getting at to that dynamic?
Yeah, there's just not that normal incentive structure. And I
Mhm.
should just mention that our friends over at the Montreal Economic Institute and Fraser Institute,
Yes.
they've been talking about this solution for a long time, well before our organization came on the scenes. They've done a lot of
Mhm.
research on it, so if people are interested in it, check out those two organizations. But in a nutshell, this is the problem: is we don't have that incentive structure, and if we move to that model where you figure out almost like a rate card. Here's what we're going to pay out for different types of procedures. Well, the next thing to do for governments is to look at how they could pay that to anyone who could do it.
Mm.
If someone wants to open up a nonprofit clinic, or maybe it's a for-profit clinic, whatever, they get the same amount of money. And when we were in France last year and Sweden the year before, and uh, they don't have this ideological problem, I would say, certainly not to the same degree that we have here in Canada, where there's, the special interest groups will,
Mhm.
shriek about, oh my goodness, it's a private provider, whatever. The approach in those countries, France, Sweden, wherever, is, they'll fund any provider if they can help a patient and provide quality treatment. And that should be the mindset of governments. Let's partner with anyone who can help a patient. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if the person is or if the clinic is private, government run, or nonprofit, the money follows the patient where the patient goes and figures out the best
Ah.
care for them. So that's the second thing that needs to happen. It's because
Okay. So that's again part of the solution is that the money needs to follow the patient, and we don't care who delivers the service. Like if I go to see my dentist, which I did this past week, I
yeah,
don't care who my dentist is as long as they're doing a good job,
right,
right? And the
right,
money follows me. It doesn't come through some, and it's anyways. But in this case, though, you're saying it would still be publicly funded, but we don't care who's going to be the parties doing the health operation as long as they're capable and up to standard, right?
yeah. And Quebec has been experimenting with this now for several years, and they found success already. And what you tend to see happen, David, is that the cost per procedure tends to come down as
Mm.
health facilities have more flexibility. They can figure out how they can deliver services more cost effectively. The incentive models change, right? So when the money comes in for a particular service, and if that service can get more money by adjusting something to get more patients in, they're going to do it. The money is going to be focused on people involved in helping deliver the service. Right now, what we have is governments that fund health systems. In these European countries, what they do is they fund services to patients, and there's a difference there. So the money comes into the bureaucracy, a whole bunch of it gets taken off, and then it goes to the hospital, a whole bunch gets taken off for hospital admin, whatever, and then some trickles down to services for the patients. It's different in these other models because the money is
Mm.
following the patient, it is paying for the patient to actually get something tangible.
I like that. So
Big
let's
difference.
empower the patient. Let's give them the money, not through what is it, the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
The other point that you raise as a solution and help us understand this is that we need to copy the Europeans on a very interesting directive called the cross border directive. What do you mean by that, Colin?
Yeah, so it's very similar to what we were just talking about. The money follows the patients. So in Europe, patients have the right to go in the, I should clarify, in the European Union, patients have the right to go to another European Union country, pay for surgery, and then get reimbursed by their home government, up to what the home government would spend to provide that procedure locally. And just to be clear, the patient has to have like a doctor's requisition first. So
Hmm.
let's say you're
Hmm.
living in Sweden, and for whatever reason there's a long wait time. Maybe it's 4 months to get your knee done. You could say, well, I don't want to wait 4 months. I'm in a lot of pain,
Hmm.
whatever. I'm going to go to Germany. And, in Germany, it costs 10,000 euros. And let's say it costs 10,000 euros if the government provides it in Sweden. Well, then the patient can go to Germany, pay the 10,000 euros, and they can get reimbursed by the Swedish
Ah,
government. So if you think
okay.
about it, David, it really opens up the options available to patients instead of what's just in their jurisdiction. Suddenly, you've got thousands and thousands of providers to choose from, and so it's
Wow.
very much empowers patients. They, from what I've read on this, European patients don't have to use it that much because they don't have
Mhm,
these wait time problems
mhm.
that we do in Canada. So it's not used as much, and the European Union will. They've done some studies and they've realized that, hey, we got to inform European Union patients a bit more about this option. But
Mhm.
anyway, it certainly helps hundreds of thousands of EU patients every year because, like I say, you're
Wow.
looking at lots of healthcare options
Well,
to them.
what an exciting vision. We could learn from the Europeans and we could help people get the help they need, and we could still keep our costs in a reasonable basis because you have choice. And to me, that seems like it makes, well, what is it? A lot of common sense.
Yeah.
Imagine that. So I guess maybe the larger strategic question as well, because we've talked about, the impact that all these stories have on people, the pain, the agony that Canadians feel when they are confronted by a kind of a dysfunctional healthcare system.
Mhm.
The question I have, Colin, is why does this matter to our country in Canada? Like, why does this issue matter? If we, you know, I mean, I guess I get the picture with individuals, but why does this matter to us as a nation?
Uh, it's a good question. I think it matters on multiple levels. Like you said, individuals. I mean, no one wants to live with chronic pain. No one wants to die before, uh, before they. I don't want to say that before they should, but no one wants to die prematurely, right?
Mhm.
You have a serious problem, you want to go and get it treated, right? So you can live as long as possible. So there's definitely the individual need and want to have a better healthcare system. There's other reasons too, right? I mean, when you've got people off on waiting lists and they can't work, well, then that affects businesses. It affects the wealth generation of this country. It affects
Indeed.
people on an individual level, right? If you're not working, you're not making as much money. Um,
Mhm.
so there's those reasons. I mean, even just as a nation wanting to be an attractive place for people to live and stay and raise their families and have fun and whatever, right? I mean, if you have a bad healthcare system, some people eventually are going to go, okay, I'm leaving, right? I mean,
You're
you
right.
can't depend on this, especially if you have a loved one who has a chronic condition where they
Mhm.
do need the system a lot. Then you might just pack up and leave. So there's all kinds of problems, and I just want to be clear, David. Every day in this country, you will find people that have wonderful experiences with the healthcare system.
Indeed.
It's
Yes.
not all bad, and that's wonderful. That's great. We want to hear that. The problem is that too many patients are falling between the cracks. That's
Mhm.
the problem. Too many people are stuck dealing with chronic pain. Maybe they're dying on a waiting list. They're getting a misdiagnosis, whatever. There's too many problems. Millions of Canadians don't have a family doctor. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There's just
Mhm.
too many problems. That's why we need to look at reform. And we did a whole documentary on this. If anyone's really interested in this topic, they can go to healthreformnow.ca and watch it. We explore these different components. But
Mhm.
the good news in all this, David, is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We're not trying to figure something out that no one else has figured out. It's not like we're trying
Mhm.
to colonize Mars and there's no one to look
Yes.
for, right? There's lots of countries with developed universal healthcare systems. They're doing exceptionally well.
Mhm.
The good news is that we can copy what they're doing right, bring those policies to Canada, maybe tweak things a little bit, and ultimately give Canadians better healthcare services through the public system, but also while giving them choice outside of it as well. So that's the
Right
good
on.
news of all of this.
Well, and Colin, I like your attitude. We can do better as Canada for Canadians in this area, and we can learn from others. Surely we are not so presumptuous to think that we've got all the answers. So we don't. We can learn from, well, those Europeans like Sweden, and you mentioned all kinds of other, I
Yeah.
think, very exciting examples. And I think the other point of reality here, Colin, is that this situation, dare I say, is getting worse. It's not getting better. I mean, you just showed the stats. They
Hmm.
speak for themselves. We hear this anecdotally where the money is getting worse. And I would say that a lot of this, like, it's interesting you mentioned about the way we've managed the healthcare portfolio. We've not only thrown more money at it, we've borrowed more money from the next generation to
Hmm.
fund this nonsense in the form of bigger deficits and debt. And And I don't know, I don't get the morality of that. Is borrowing from the next generation for what? A healthcare system? We should be able to live within our means today to
Yeah.
provide that healthcare system. So
It's
that's my speech for today, Colin. But I see a situation where we can do better, but the trajectory doesn't look positive because we have, what is it again? Oh, yeah, an aging society, and we have more expensive technology,
Mhm.
and we have in this country record amounts of immigration. It still remains high, well over 1 million people who are all getting health cards, Colin. So help me, isn't the trajectory even worse?
It's not good, yeah. And you'll hear this point too, David, and people will sometimes say, "Well, it's because of COVID. COVID messed everything up."
Oh, yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
true. The numbers were getting worse well before COVID. You showed a couple slides there. You could see this is a problem that's been growing for 30 some years, whatever it is. So COVID made things worse, but things were getting bad before COVID even hit. And like you said, we've got an aging population. The crazy thing about this is that we've known we've had an aging population for 50 some years, 60 years, whatever it is. It's
Indeed.
a long time to plan. The problem is governments didn't plan. They're so short-sighted. They
Hmm.
should have been socking away billions of dollars every year when the baby boom generation was working, paying lots of taxes. They should have said, okay, we got to save some of this money because someday these baby boomers are going to need the healthcare system and we're
You're
going to have
right.
to pay for them to get their knees done and their hips and whatever. Governments didn't do that. They blew all the money and then some. They ran huge deficits. So now we're at a stage where we've got a lot of government debt. So it's not like we have savings that we can use for this. And we've got an aging population on top of it. So, like I say, the good news is that we can improve things if we copy other countries. It's going to be extremely difficult because we do have this pressure because of the aging population. It should have started a long time ago, but to do nothing is not an option. And again, I'll tell you one more really bit of good news here in all this. Public opinion shows clearly the public is ready for reform.
Oh, is
Uh,
that right?
I mentioned this option about choice between using the public system or private options. 61% of Canadians agree. That's a healthy majority. Any party could run on that tomorrow and they could win, provided the
Hmm.
rest of their platform is good. But the point is that the public is ready for reform. Lots of the reform measures we talked about, that cross-border directive policy from Europe, where you can get reimbursed for care in other provinces or in other countries in Europe. 73% of Canadians think we should copy that. So
Ah,
you go down the options. The public is ready for reform. The problem is the political class has been very slow to understand that and respond by promising and enacting change. So that
interesting.
is where the holdup is we need the political class to kind of realize, this isn't the healthcare debate from 30 years ago. Canadians are ready for reform. Special interest groups are going to fight you tooth and nail, but if you have some
Yeah.
good messaging and you're clear with Canadians and you're honest about what you're doing,
Hmm.
I think the public will certainly support it.
Okay. So we know the status quo ain't acceptable. And we know that Health Canada just came out a report last week, as I recall, that somehow we're going to be 70,000 healthcare workers short. And without going into details, I'd argue that's even understated. So the question I have is one of, well, it's kind of a chicken and egg question, Colin. It has to do with political courage. Do the politicians get their courage as well as citizens wake up and speak up with courage and say this is no longer acceptable? Or are we going to find, well, are we going to find any courageous politicians that have the backbone to stand up and say this is unacceptable under my watch to tolerate the thousands of Canadians that are dying on waiting lists every year?
Yeah.
Or is it both? What is the answer, my friend? Is it the chicken or the egg?
Good question. I think really what we need is the political class to wake up because the public is there, right?
Oh,
And it's
okay.
it's a matter of getting to the politicians and just kind of, I think a lot of them are, the a lot of people that get into politics, they've been following it for a long time and they're familiar with these debates from the 90s and the early 2000s where you couldn't talk about health reform. You just had to promise more money and then move on to some other issue during a campaign because you didn't want to talk about this. It's a mess.
Yes.
Um, but
It's like
I
a sacred cow, right?
yeah. So I think
Sacred cow.
getting to those politicians and just informing them, hey, look, the times have changed. The public is ready for reform. Here's some of the solutions, right? Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is what these guys are doing, right?
Yes.
Promise
Yeah.
these, the public likes it. There's your platform for healthcare, at least. The BC Conservatives, full credit to them. They had a very good
Indeed,
platform
they did.
on health reform in the last election. And it's I think they realized that, hey, wait, this is something we can run on here because the system is really bad in BC. It's bad across the country, but they
It
realize it.
really is.
So I think other political parties in other parts of the country, all of them across the spectrum, I would encourage them to look at these policy solutions because I think really it's something that parties across the spectrum could start to get behind if they put patients first, and that's the big question. They're going to listen to some special interest groups who don't want change because that might you know change their little fiefdom, or are they going to put patients first? If they put patients first, these policies are a no-brainer.
Right on. So this has been a far-reaching conversation, Colin, and I have two final questions. The first one is
Mhm.
that we have a new prime minister. His name is Mark Carney. If you were to give him advice on this file, let alone every other provincial premier, because it's really the provincial premiers that are also at the lead of these issues, what
Yeah.
advice would you give them?
I don't think Prime Minister Carney would take my advice. I think at the very least, Ottawa needs to do this on healthcare, right? I don't think they're really going to change the funding in this whole approach. I mean, there's a model that I think makes a lot of sense, and that's where Ottawa just gives the provinces the tax room, and Ottawa stops funding healthcare.
Mm,
Provinces can raise the money, Ottawa would cut their taxes, and then the provinces raise the money locally, they spend it locally, they're in complete control. They don't have to worry about Ottawa coming in and hitting them
mhm.
over the head if they don't like something. I don't think.
So get the federal fingers
Yes, get them
off
out of
the
healthcare. Get
provincial
them
health
out
file,
of healthcare.
period.
Just
Get
let
out
the
of it.
provinces run it.
Yes.
Uh,
Nice.
and you'd still have that same funding that I'm talking about. Just to be clear, David, it
Mhm.
would be raised locally instead of coming from Ottawa.
Right on. Yes.
So I think that would make sense. I don't think he would do that, but maybe what he might be open to is just keep the money flowing, but change the Canada Health Act so that sort of the key need at the provincial level to get that money is universality. Make
Yes.
sure that everyone's covered, and keep the money flowing that way, and allow the provinces the flexibility because some of these changes would require Ottawa to change the Canada Health Act to allow them. So that would be my
You bet.
recommendation to him. Just allow the provinces, give them a lot of flexibility, let them experiment. We've got 10 provinces, let them all try different things. If one does something exceptionally
Mhm.
well, then the other one should copy it. I mean, but
Right
it's
on.
good to do that when you have Ottawa constantly coming in and threatening provinces with funding reductions because it doesn't like something for political reasons.
You bet. So, hear ye, hear ye. The federal government should stay in its constitutional lane, let the provinces innovate and be flexible and get on with it.
Yeah.
And then the last question I have for you, Colin, has to do with citizens. What can we do to move this ball forward so that we can save lives and help move forward our quality of life in this country when it comes to healthcare?
That's a very good question. I think there's a few things. For starters, take this discussion that we've had, David, and people should share it with their friends. Talk
Right
about it.
on.
Get more people engaged and thinking about these issues, aware of them. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about, I've talked with everyday Canadians, and they're like, "Oh, I had no idea that was like that." So, inform people, and I think that will help go a long way. So that helps give the room for politicians to be able to make the changes if people understand why they're needed. So that's number one. Number two, people who are watching this should take this podcast and send it to their politicians. Get them to watch it. Send it to candidates, people that want to become politicians, so that ultimately more and more Canadians are informed. And yeah, just generally speak out. Email your elected officials when there's something going on. Let them know your thoughts. A lot of people don't do that. So when politicians do get an email, quite often they'll read it. They'll get hear the public's views.
Well, well said. Colin Craig, the president of secondstreet.org. It's been a pleasure to talk with you about healthcare. And in the meantime, let's join hands together as citizens and speak up. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Thanks a lot, David.